Welcome to a story buried deep within the cold soil of America's forgotten past, a tale so unnerving that historians once tried to erase it from record. Today, we travel to the mist-wrapped ridges of the Appalachian Mountains, where two young women, just 19 years old, built an empire of fear that would stain the land for generations. Their names were Clara Whitmore and Evelyn Ashford, the Appalachian heiresses whom history tried and failed to forget. It was the winter of 1873, and the eastern Kentucky mountains were locked beneath sheets of ice. The narrow trails between towns were half buried, the rivers swollen and angry under frozen bridges. Life here moved at its own slow, brutal rhythm, isolated, self-governed, and ruled not by law, but by fear, money, and family honor. Pike County at that time was a place where a man's word mattered more than any signature, and justice could take weeks, sometimes months, to arrive from distant courts. At the heart of this rugged isolation stood the Whitmore estate, a sprawling property of timber and stone perched above the valley like a kingdom. Its owner, Jonathan Whitmore, had died unexpectedly that same winter, leaving behind not only vast lands but unanswered questions. His daughter, Clara, only 18 then, was now the sole heir, and her inheritance made her one of the wealthiest young women in the region. The official record said her father's death was caused by pneumonia. Yet whispers in Pikeville, taverns told another story of a man found cold in his study, a decanter of brandy half empty beside him, his eyes open and unseeing as if startled by someone he knew. Within weeks of Jonathan's funeral, Clara moved through her grief with a steadiness that unsettled those who knew her. She took control of the estate's ledgers, attended the timber auctions herself, and refused all suggestions of marriage that came her way. For an unmarried young woman in rural Kentucky, such behavior was scandalous, almost indecent. But Clara didn't seem to care. She carried herself like someone who had already measured the world and found it unimpressive. That same winter, fate brought Evelyn Ashford to the Whitmore mansion. She too was 19. Though her face bore the quiet maturity of someone who had seen more than her years should allow. Evelyn had come seeking work after losing her entire family in a fire that consumed their small farmhouse in Letcher County. The tragedy had been reported as accidental, though no one could quite explain how the flames spread so quickly or why the doors were found bolted from the outside. Evelyn arrived with little more than a worn suitcase and a letter of recommendation, but what she carried unseen was far heavier, an unspoken rage that had no name. When Clara met Evelyn for the first time, something electric passed between them. Not friendship at first sight, but something deeper, harder to define. Within weeks, Clara dismissed her other servants, keeping only Evelyn close. Soon she was no longer just a housekeeper. She was a partner in every sense except name. Together they began managing the Whitmore business, and with startling success. In an age when women were expected to remain silent and submissive, Clara and Evelyn were neither. They attended business meetings surrounded by men twice their age, inspected sawmills, and negotiated contracts that seasoned merchants struggled to match. At first, their boldness drew mockery. Then it drew fear. The first man to vanish was Thomas Brennan, a merchant from Louisville who had traveled to Pike County in the summer of 1874 to finalize a timber contract with Clara Whitmore. Brennan had been seen dining at the Whitmore mansion, and then he was gone. His carriage was found abandoned on a muddy road, the horses still harnessed but restless, as if they'd been left too long. The sheriff's search turned up nothing. In those mountains, people said men disappeared all the time, slipped on a trail, drowned in a swollen creek, eaten by wolves perhaps. But those who knew Brennan doubted it. He was cautious, practical, a man who didn't take unnecessary risks. 3 months later, another man disappeared. A lawyer from Lexington sent to dispute Clara's inheritance on behalf of distant relatives. He too was last seen heading up the winding road to the Whitmore estate on a foggy morning, and like Brennan, he never returned. By autumn, whispers had spread through Pikeville. Some said the young heiresses had cursed the land. Others said they were blessed by the devil himself. A local paper, the Mountain Echo, dared to suggest that the string of disappearances was statistically improbable, and that perhaps the estate warranted further investigation. A week after the editorial was printed, the newspaper's office caught fire in the dead of night. Its editor, Robert Hutchins, barely escaped with his life. Witnesses swore they saw two women riding away from town under the cover of darkness, their cloaks fluttering like shadows, but no one dared name them. Clara and Evelyn maintained their composure. They attended church every Sunday in fine Cincinnati dresses, donated to local charities, and hosted dinners that drew the town's most respected figures. They were polite, generous, graceful, and utterly untouchable. Behind that charm, though, something darker was taking root, a growing sense of invincibility that would soon drive them far, beyond the limits of decency. By the winter of 1875, heavy snow had sealed the mountains. The roads were impassable, and Pike County was cut off from the outside world. Inside the Whitmore mansion, servants whispered of strange noises in the night, of footsteps echoing in the basements, of faint cries muffled by stone. The mansion itself stood like a fortress on the hill, its windows glowing faintly against the storm, hiding what would soon become one of the most horrifying secrets in Appalachian history. The winter of 1875 arrived with an unrelenting fury that buried Pike County beneath an ocean of white. The snow came early that year, and for nearly 6 weeks, the narrow roads became invisible beneath drifts that reached the tops of stone fences. The Whitmore estate, perched high above the valley, was now a world unto itself, a fortress of wealth and mystery isolated by both distance and fear. To the townspeople below, the mansion's windows flickered faintly through the storm like the eyes of something ancient watching the valley. There were rumors, of course there were. Servants who came and went whispered about the sounds they heard in the dead of night. Low moans carried through the pipes, the scrape of shovels echoing from beneath the floors, and faint laughter that did not belong to anyone they recognized. But the Whitmore women paid well, and loyalty in those mountains often came at the price of silence. During those long, snowbound months, Clara and Evelyn began what would later become the most chilling phase of their transformation. They hired men from distant counties, workers, unfamiliar with Pikeville's gossip, to renovate the estate's lower levels. None of the local builders would take the job. The mansion's reputation was already too heavy with unease, so the women brought in outsiders, paying in advance and keeping them well fed. Their wages more than most saw in a season. The work went on for weeks, even through the blizzards, the sound of picks and hammers muffled beneath the earth. What exactly those men built would remain unknown for decades. County records of the project vanished mysteriously soon after. But years later, when investigators unearthed partial blueprints and fragments of testimony, a grim picture emerged. The basement of the Whitmore mansion had been expanded into a labyrinth, a series of narrow tunnels and interconnected chambers cut deep into the rock. Beneath the hill, each passage reinforced with stone, each chamber designed with ventilation shafts and drains. It was construction far beyond what any normal estate would require. When the snow began to melt in early March, the mountains seemed to breathe again, releasing streams of ice-cold water down through the valleys. But with the thaw came a different kind of movement, one that would bring the first real attempt at justice to Pike County. A sheriff from neighboring Floyd County, Harold Mackenzie, had been receiving letters from families of missing men. They all shared the same refrain. Husbands, sons, or brothers had gone to Pike County on business and had never returned. Local lawmen, bound by political debts or personal fear, had dismissed the cases as accidents. Mackenzie, however, was different. He was known across the region for his integrity, a man too stubborn for bribes and too proud to be intimidated. In April 1875, he rode into Pikeville with 2 deputies, carrying a worn notebook filled with names, dates, and locations, the beginnings of a pattern he couldn't ignore. Within days, he began hearing the same name again and again: Whitmore. Every missing man, it seemed, had last been seen heading toward the Whitmore estate. Mackenzie's investigation was quiet but thorough. He visited the taverns where travelers lodged, compared witness statements, and followed the tracks of trade deals that never concluded. When he finally stood before the county judge, an aging man named Cornelius Wade, his findings were clear. 7 men gone in less than 14 months, all linked to the same place, all under the same shadow. But Wade hesitated. Clara Whitmore was not only one of the county's largest taxpayers, she had donated generously to the courthouse renovations, funded the local school's expansion, and provided food to struggling families during the drought the year before. To accuse her without proof, he warned, could spark outrage and destroy reputations that propped up the town's fragile economy. Mackenzie didn't flinch. "The law doesn't bend for the wealthy," he told the judge. After a long silence, Wade finally signed the warrant, a single page that would have changed Appalachian history if not for what happened next. That evening, Mackenzie dined at the Pikeville Inn. Witnesses remembered him cheerful but exhausted, his notebook lying open beside his plate. He spoke to no one about the coming search, though those who saw him said he seemed unusually restless, pausing often to look toward the window where the rain tapped softly against the glass. Later that night, as the innkeeper prepared to close, he saw the sheriff heading up the staircase to his room, carrying his notes and his revolver. It was the last time anyone saw him alive. At dawn, the deputies found Mackenzie lying motionless at the bottom of the staircase. His neck was broken, his revolver still holstered, his papers scattered. The coroner ruled it an accident, a tragic fall on wet wooden steps. But those who looked closer found the details strange. The sheriff had fallen backward, not forward, and there were faint marks on the banister, as though someone else had been there. Still, no one spoke those suspicions aloud. The next morning, Clara and Evelyn attended the funeral dressed in black silk, veils drawn, offering condolences to the grieving widow. Clara even handed her a sealed envelope, containing a generous sum for the family's expenses. "He was a good man," she said softly, her voice steady. "The mountains will miss his kind." The following week, the investigation was closed. The search warrant expired unused. Pike County exhaled as though a great storm had passed. But something colder than snow had settled in its place, a silence so thick that no one dared disturb it. That spring, the Whitmore estate flourished as never before. Timber contracts multiplied, mines expanded, and new lands were quietly purchased. Yet no one could explain how profits were rising faster than production. The numbers didn't add up, unless one accounted for the fact that, somewhere in those hills, men who came with gold in their pockets never left to spend it. By the summer of 1875, Clara and Evelyn were no longer seen as curious oddities. They had become untouchable. The townspeople, once skeptical, now spoke of them with reverence, or fear disguised as respect. The Whitmore heiresses employed dozens, paid well, and carried themselves with such poise that even the church elders could find no fault. To challenge them was to invite ruin, and everyone in Pike County knew it. But beneath that polished veneer, in the tunnels carved into the bedrock of their estate, something unspeakable had begun. And by the time the leaves turned red that autumn, the true horror of the Whitmore mansion would be far beyond anything those mountains had ever known. By the end of 1875, the mountains surrounding Pikeville wore their autumn colors like old blood, deep reds and burning, gold fading beneath the gray skies. The valley had returned to its uneasy rhythm, though people still spoke of Sheriff Mackenzie in hushed tones. They said the man had died chasing shadows, that it was folly to go prying into the affairs of the Whitmore women. Some whispered that the mountains themselves had swallowed him whole for daring to disturb their peace. But those who had seen the look in Clara's eyes at his funeral, the calm, measured sorrow like someone admiring their own handiwork, knew better. The Whitmore estate stood untouched through it all. Work continued at the sawmills, the mines, and the lumber yards, each operation managed with unnerving precision. Clara and Evelyn seemed tireless, inspecting shipments, calculating profits, and signing new contracts that expanded their reach far beyond Pike County. Their influence grew so vast that even local lawmen now deferred to them. When disputes arose, it was Clara's opinion that settled them. Her word had become law in everything but name. To the outside world, they were paragons of Southern virtue. They donated to the church, funded the rebuilding of a bridge destroyed in the spring floods, and even hosted a harvest feast for the workers and their families. Photographs taken during that event still exist, faded. Images of smiling men and women gathered. In front of the mansion, children holding paper lanterns, and, in the center, Clara and Evelyn standing side by side. Clara's dark hair was pinned neatly beneath her hat, her expression composed and distant. Evelyn's lighter hair caught the afternoon light like a halo, her gaze fixed just off camera, as if already watching something beyond the moment. But beneath this portrait of civility, fear had taken root. The workers knew better than to wander too close to the mansion at night. They spoke of strange lights flickering in the basement windows, of wagons arriving long after dusk and leaving empty before dawn. One man claimed he saw a trail of blood in the snow leading from the stables toward the woods. The next morning, that same man packed his family and left Pike County without a word. In those days, the Whitmore mansion had become more than a building. It was a presence. The people of Pikeville began to treat it as one might treat an ancient god, with outward reverence and inward dread. Even the pastor, Reverend Elijah Stone, began preaching cryptic sermons about wolves in silk and virtue built upon graves. His words trembled with conviction but never named names. Everyone knew who he meant, and everyone also knew that some truths were better left unsaid. And yet, for all their power, Clara and Evelyn understood the danger of gossip. The pastor's veiled warnings could not be ignored. One Sunday after service, the two women approached him with quiet smiles and asked for a private meeting. The following afternoon, they visited his parsonage. The pastor's house sat at the edge of town, a small structure surrounded by dying apple trees. Neighbors saw the two women arrive in their black carriage just before noon. They stayed for nearly 3 hours. No one knows what was said inside that house, but afterward Reverend Stone's sermons changed. The fire in his voice cooled. The warning stopped. He began to praise the Whitmore women as examples of charity and Christian virtue. When asked about his sudden change of heart, he simply said, "I have seen enough to know that judgment belongs to God alone." Years later, when his private journals were discovered, one entry dated that very afternoon read, "May God have mercy on our souls. I have learned today what should not exist under heaven." From that moment onward, the Whitmore name was no longer whispered in fear. It was spoken with reverence, even awe. The townsfolk convinced themselves that the rumors were exaggerations, that the disappearances were tragic coincidences, that their benefactors could not possibly be guilty of evil. Denial became a form of survival, but not everyone was fooled. In early 1876, a federal land agent arrived in Pikeville to survey mining rights in the area. His name was Samuel Porter, a meticulous man who prided himself on uncovering corruption in frontier counties. Porter was no ordinary bureaucrat. He had a soldier's discipline and an investigator's suspicion. He kept to himself, asked quiet questions, and took careful notes. Within weeks, he began connecting the same threads Mackenzie had traced the year before, a series of vanishings that led, inevitably, to the Whitmore estate. But unlike Mackenzie, Porter did not go to Clara and Evelyn immediately. He observed. He watched their daily patterns, the carriages that arrived late at night, the shipments that left the estate unmarked. His notes, later, discovered in Washington archives, describe a power structure operating outside both state and federal reach. He wrote that the two women at its center possess influence, greater than any official authority here. They command not by title, but by fear masked as grace. On April 4th, 1876, Porter sent his findings to Washington by courier, recommending immediate intervention. He did not live to see whether his warning was received. A week later, Porter's horse was found grazing by a canyon trail 30 miles from Pikeville. The man himself lay broken at the bottom of the ravine. His body shattered, but his face strangely peaceful. Local officials ruled it an accident. They said his horse must have stumbled. But those who saw the body swore there was something too deliberate about the way. His neck had been twisted, as if death had come not from a fall, but from hands. When word reached Clara and Evelyn, they expressed sorrow, donating a small fortune to the agent's widow in recognition of his service to our community. The gesture silenced any remaining doubts. By summer, their business empire had grown beyond the mountains. Timber, minerals, and land holdings spread across counties. Yet beneath the surface, their wealth had another source, one hidden even from their closest associates. Men who came to Pikeville seeking profit often carried cash, gold, or contracts. And when they vanished into the Whitmore mansion, their fortunes quietly changed hands. Clara and Evelyn's cruelty was not the chaos of madwomen. It was organized, deliberate, almost professional. The mountains themselves became their accomplices, swallowing bodies, hiding trails, and erasing evidence beneath fog and frost. In a region where justice traveled slowly and power ruled absolutely, two 19-year-old women had found the perfect formula for impunity. And as 1876 dawned over the Appalachians, their legend, part horror, part fascination, was only beginning to take shape. The spring of 1876 came late to the Appalachian Mountains, as if the land itself hesitated to wake. When the snow finally melted, the valleys below Pikeville filled with mist and the scent of damp earth. Streams burst from their banks, washing away old bridges and carving new paths through the woods. The Whitmore mansion, perched high above the town, stood untouched by the floods, its oak walls darkened by rain but defiant. Unmovable, to the people below it seemed almost alive, a sentinel watching as the seasons changed. Inside its stone corridors, Clara Whitmore and Evelyn Ashford ruled like queens. They were both 19 now, young in age, but hardened by power. The months following Samuel, Porter's accident had turned them from cautious schemers into something more dangerous, women who no longer believed they could be caught. The Whitmore business flourished beyond comprehension. Timber contracts expanded into neighboring counties. Mines grew richer under new management, and investors from Louisville and Lexington poured money into their enterprises. But what few knew was how the profits multiplied in ways that defied accounting. Shipments that left the estate often contained miscellaneous goods, unrecorded by ledgers. Certain transactions were signed by men who no longer existed. The Whitmore accounts grew fatter each month, and yet their production barely changed. They had perfected the art of making death profitable. Still, not everyone was blind. Rumors traveled down the rail lines, carried by merchants and drifters. Stories of two young women who ran their business, empire with uncanny precision, and a hint of menace. Some called them pioneers of a new era, symbols of female strength in a world dominated by men. Others whispered that they were something else entirely. Predators cloaked in silk, playing a game the law could not yet name. It was around this time that a journalist named William Hartford read about them. Hartford was a correspondent for the Cincinnati Herald, known for his progressive views and fascination with the hidden corners of America. When he heard tales of two women running a successful mining and timber operation deep in the Kentucky mountains, he was intrigued. He imagined a story about ambition, about women defying their prescribed roles, about the changing face of the South after the Civil War. Hartford arrived in Pikeville in July 1876, traveling alone with a small trunk and a leather-bound notebook. His manner was polite, scholarly, the kind of man who believed that truth was always worth the journey. At first, he was charmed by the mountains, writing in his notes about the majesty of the Appalachians and the rugged honesty of their people. He visited taverns, spoke with merchants, and asked gently about the Whitmore sisters. Most people smiled and changed the subject. A few warned him not to go asking questions he didn't need answers to, but Hartford's curiosity only deepened. Within days, he arranged an introduction to Clara and Evelyn through the town's banker, who owed them money and was eager to please. The journalist described his first meeting with them in detail. His notes would later be found, sealed in an envelope in his room. He wrote of Clara's composure, how she spoke with quiet authority that made every man in the room listen as if she were the law itself. Evelyn, by contrast, remained mostly silent, her green eyes studying him with an intensity that made him uneasy. He left that evening convinced that the women were extraordinary, intelligent, modern, almost visionary. He could not have known that they had already begun studying him, too. Over the next 2 weeks, Hartford visited the estate several times. He interviewed the workers, examined ledgers, and dined at the mansion more than once. At first, his notes glowed with admiration. These women, he wrote, represent a new age of industry. They are disciplined, generous, and efficient, living proof that ability is not bound by gender. But as the days passed, a shadow crept into his writing. He began to notice the fear in the eyes of those who spoke the Whitmore name. When he asked about the missing men whose business dealings had ended abruptly, silence met him like a wall. Even the tavern keeper, who had once been talkative, avoided his gaze. Hartford recorded in one entry, "There is something wrong here. The people behave as if under a spell. They fear these women but cannot admit why. Every trail I follow leads back to the same hill and ends in silence." He was close to the truth, but not close enough to understand how much danger he was in. On the evening of August 15, 1876, Hartford dined once more at the Whitmore mansion. He had written earlier that day that he intended to press them directly about the disappearances and seek clarity on matters the town dares not discuss. He sealed those notes in an envelope and left, them with the innkeeper, instructing him to send them to his editor if he did not return within 3 days. Witnesses later recalled seeing his carriage climbing the winding road to the estate as dusk settled over the valley. The lamps in the mansion windows glowed faintly through the fog, beckoning him toward the last supper of his life. No one ever saw him again. 3 days later, the innkeeper sent the envelope to the Cincinnati Herald. When Hartford's editor read his notes, he immediately contacted Kentucky authorities, demanding an investigation. But by the time marshals arrived in Pikeville, the trail had already gone cold. Clara and Evelyn received the officers graciously. They confirmed that Hartford had dined with them, had spoken animatedly about his article, and left around 10 o'clock that night. They expressed concern for his safety, even offering a $1,000 reward for any information. Their servants told the same story, calm, consistent, rehearsed. The carriage Hartford had rented was eventually found abandoned on a narrow trail. Several miles away, its horses released and grazing in the woods. The marshal's report concluded that the journalist had likely become lost during the night and perished. Due to the treacherous terrain, the matter was closed. In Cincinnati, the Herald published Hartford's notes posthumously under the title, "The Vanishing Reporter of Pike County." For a brief moment, his story sparked outrage, but it was 1876, and the nation was consumed with presidential elections and the slow recovery from economic collapse. The death of a journalist in the Kentucky mountains simply did not command the headlines for long, and so the Whitmore heiresses once again escaped the reach of justice, their names unblemished, their empire untouched. By winter's first frost, they had become legends, 2 women who could charm a town, manipulate the law, and make men disappear without leaving a trace. In the silent woods below their mansion, the wind carried their story like a prayer no one dared speak aloud. Beware the hill. The Whitmore girls see everything. The disappearance of William Hartford should have changed everything. A journalist from a major city vanishing under mysterious circumstances. It should have drawn national attention, perhaps even federal intervention. But the year was 1876, and America was drowning in its own chaos. The country was still reeling from the economic depression. Caused by the panic of 1873, the presidential election was dividing the nation, and the Appalachian Mountains were too far, too wild, too insignificant for Washington's concern. For Clara Whitmore and Evelyn Ashford, the storm outside their hills became their shield. While the rest of the nation looked elsewhere, the women tightened their grip on Pike County. With Hartford gone and the last curious eyes turned away, they emerged from their isolation as figures of unmatched influence. By now, Clara had perfected her role as the public face of their empire. She moved with confidence through the towns and cities of Kentucky, speaking to merchants, judges, and governors as if she were their equal. In Lexington, she attended charity galas and road-building meetings, her poise and beauty earning her admiration from the very men who once mocked her for managing her own estate. Newspapers described her as a prodigy of business and grace, unaware that the hands they praised had long been stained with blood. Evelyn, meanwhile, remained the strategist, quiet, watchful, and ruthless. She managed the ledgers with surgical precision, transforming their illicit gains into clean investments. Under her direction, the Whitmore fortune expanded into railroads, mining companies, and regional banks. In letters later uncovered in Louisville archives, bankers described her as remarkably astute, almost unnervingly perceptive for her age. The two women had created something remarkable. A self-sustaining machine that laundered wealth, silenced suspicion, and rewarded loyalty. Their workers were well paid, their communities supported, their debts forgiven. No one wanted to believe the whispers anymore. Fear had been replaced with dependency, and dependency, Clara understood, was the purest form of control. But the human mind is never fully silent. Beneath the surface of Pike County's new prosperity, unease still simmered. Some workers spoke of strange tasks. Boxes carried into the woods at night, heavy and sealed. Others mentioned repairs being made to the mansion's basement, always supervised by the Whitmore women themselves, never by outsiders. And once, during a particularly harsh winter, two men who had been digging near the estate refused to return to work. They left town without collecting their pay, muttering about walls that breathed and voices under the stone. By 1877, the mansion had become legend. Children in the valley were warned not to go near it after dark. Travelers crossing the mountain roads swore they saw lights moving through its windows long after midnight, even when no smoke rose from the chimneys. But the strangest thing, locals said, was the silence. No dogs barking, no laughter, no sound of the piano Clara was known to play, only the hum of the wind through the pines and the creak of the old weather vane turning endlessly above the roof. That silence was broken one autumn night when a mill worker named Jacob Miller stumbled into the tavern drunk and trembling. He had worked at the Whitmore estate for nearly 3 years, loyal and discreet until that evening when liquor loosened his fear. He spoke of tunnels beneath the house, of rooms built deep underground with walls blackened by soot. He spoke of crates buried in the woods and of payments made to those who asked too many, questions to leave quietly. At first, the men around him laughed. The story was too wild, too grotesque to believe. But as Miller spoke on, his voice breaking, the laughter faded. There was something in his tone that didn't sound like drunken fantasy, something closer to confession. When he finally fell silent, no one dared ask more. The next morning, Miller was found dead in his bed. The doctor said it was alcohol poisoning. The body was buried quickly and the matter ended there. The same week, Clara and Evelyn sent flowers and money to Miller's widow, their letter of condolence written in elegant, practiced handwriting. To the town, it seemed like another act of kindness, the sort of grace that had long defined them. But to the few who had heard Miller's last words, it felt like a warning, and yet no one spoke. Pikeville was thriving again. Its economy depended on the Whitmore name. The lumber and mining operations fed the town, employed its men, and filled its coffers. Fear was bad for business, and business was good. So life went on. The spring of 1877 brought torrential rains that turned roads into rivers. Floodwaters roared through the valleys, erasing old tracks and exposing long-buried roots. And in that chaos, the mountain gave up a secret. A fisherman near the Cumberland River found a body tangled among driftwood. The face was unrecognizable, but the clothing was of fine quality, too fine for a local laborer. Sewn into the lining of the coat, inside a waterproof pouch, was a card that read, Henry Ashton, merchant of Louisville. Ashton had vanished 2 years earlier after setting out for Pike County on business with the Whitmore estate. The sheriff who received the body was Thomas Brenner, a man whose reputation for honesty was as solid as the mountains themselves. He'd heard stories of the Whitmore women, everyone had, but unlike most, he didn't believe in superstition or coincidence. When he examined the decayed remains and read the name on the card, something in him hardened. He began to dig. Brenner sent letters to surrounding counties, collecting old reports of missing men. Each file, each name, each date brought the same conclusion. All roads led back to Pikeville. All roads led back to the Whitmore estate. He knew the risk. Others before him had tried to expose the truth and had ended up dead, buried or forgotten. But Brenner was meticulous. Before setting out, he prepared copies of every document, sending them to 3 different places: the governor's office, a U.S. senator in Washington, and his brother, a lawyer in Cincinnati. If anything happened to him, the truth would survive. He had no way of knowing how much that precaution would matter. When he finally rode toward Pikeville, the mist was rising over the valleys once more, and the mansion's black silhouette loomed above the trees, a place of wealth, elegance, and rot. Brenner carried with him the resolve that had kept other men alive in war and storms, but he also carried something he didn't yet recognize. He was already being watched. The sheriff and the mansion on the hill. When Sheriff Thomas Brenner first saw the Whitmore mansion through the morning fog, he understood immediately why others had hesitated to challenge its owners. It was not just a house. It was a statement, 3 stories of stone and oak, its gables like the points of a crown rising above the trees. The long drive twisted upward, through a tunnel of pines before opening into a clearing where the structure stood like a relic of another world. The air around it felt heavy, dense, as if it remembered things it didn't want to speak aloud. Brenner dismounted at the gate and stared for a long moment before knocking. The iron door knocker struck the oak with a deep, echoing sound that vanished quickly into silence. A servant appeared, young, pale, and polite, and led him into the great hall. The walls were lined with portraits, stern men in black coats and lace collars, Whitmores of generations past, their painted eyes watching every visitor who dared step inside. Clara appeared first. She moved with an ease that could only come from absolute control. Her black dress was simple but immaculate, her voice low and calm. "Sheriff Brenner," she said, offering a faint smile. "We were expecting you." Evelyn stood just behind her, her gaze fixed, unblinking. Her presence was quieter but more dangerous, like a blade resting on a table, unnoticed until it moves. Brenner removed his hat, introduced himself formally, and handed them the warrant authorizing his investigation. "We're looking into several disappearances connected to this estate," he said. "I intend to ask questions, and I expect honest answers." Clara glanced at the document, then back at him, her smile never fading. "Of course," she replied. "We have nothing to hide. You'll find our record impeccable." The conversation that followed was a contest of wills disguised as civility. Brenner asked about Henry Ashton, the merchant whose body had washed up on the riverbank. Clara claimed she remembered him well. "A kind man, though careless with his debts," she said, folding her hands neatly on the table. She insisted Ashton had left the estate alive after finalizing their agreement when Brenner asked why so many. Others had also left alive, only to vanish. Her expression softened into pity. "Sheriff," she said, "you've seen these mountains. They eat men alive. Rivers sweep them away. The wilderness is merciless to outsiders. Surely you don't believe 2 women could be to blame for all that misfortune." Evelyn said almost nothing, but when she did speak, her words were precise, surgical. "We've heard enough of these accusations over the years," she said coldly. "We are accustomed to men's suspicion. You should know that our lawyers are among the best in Kentucky. If you wish to proceed, you'd better be prepared for the cost." Brenner studied them both. There was no tremor in their voices, no guilt in their eyes. They were either innocent or monsters with a discipline beyond comprehension. When he left the mansion that evening, the sun was sinking behind the ridge, casting the house in golden shadow. He looked back once, just as the wind shifted, and saw Clara standing in an upstairs window watching him ride away. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt since the war, fear. But Brenner was not a man to yield. He set up camp in Pikeville and began his investigation in earnest. He spoke with anyone willing to talk, laborers, traders, former servants. Most denied knowing anything, but the more he pressed, the more cracks appeared. One old stonemason, coaxed into confession by a bottle of whiskey, admitted to having worked on the mansion years earlier. "They said it was for storage," the man whispered. "But I've built cellars all my life, and those weren't cellars. They were too deep, too narrow. And the air down there? It wasn't right. Felt like the ground was breathing." Another worker, long since dismissed from the estate, told him about crates buried under moonlight and men paid in gold to keep quiet. "I took the money," he said, his voice shaking. "But I ain't slept right since." Brenner recorded everything, each detail, each testimony. Still, he knew he needed more than whispers. He needed evidence that would hold in court, something undeniable. For weeks, he studied the terrain surrounding the mansion. From high ground, he could see the outline of hidden entrances built into the hillside. He noticed the way the soil near certain trees seemed disturbed. The faint scent of ash carried by the wind when the nights grew still. He began to understand that the truth lay not in the house itself, but beneath it. By early July, he was ready. He traveled to Frankfurt, the state capital, and presented his findings directly to Attorney General Marcus Sullivan, a reformer determined to root out corruption in Kentucky's frontier counties. Sullivan listened carefully, his expression darkening as Brenner described the tunnels, the missing men, the vanished records, the bodies that never surfaced. "This is more than murder," Sullivan said. "It's empire by blood." He authorized a full-scale search operation, 20 armed marshals, a state judge's warrant, and the element of surprise. The plan was simple. During the summer festival in Pikeville, when the townspeople were distracted, Brenner and his men would ride to the estate at dawn and search every inch of it, from attic to cellar. For the first time in years, it seemed that justice might finally reach the mountain. But something happened in those final days that no one could ever explain. Someone warned them. Whether it was a corrupt clerk in Sullivan's office, a bought messenger, or a frightened local afraid of losing the only wealth in the county, no one ever discovered. But word reached Clara and Evelyn before the search party even saddled their horses. When the marshals arrived at the mansion that summer morning, they found the gates open and the house silent. No servants, no carriages, no trace of life. Inside, everything was immaculate. The floors gleamed as though freshly scrubbed, the furniture polished, the air heavy with the sharp scent of lye and soap. Windows stood wide, curtains fluttering in the breeze, letting sunlight fall across empty rooms. In the grand hall, the fire was cold. A single teacup sat on the table, the liquid still warm enough to tremble when the wind passed through. Sheriff Brenner descended into the basement with 2 deputies, lanterns raised. What they found made the hair rise on their necks. The tunnels were real. They stretched deep into the hill, a labyrinth of narrow stone passages, branching into rooms lined with chains, tables, and drains carved into the floor. Every surface had been scrubbed, every trace of evidence wiped clean. But the smell lingered, copper and rot beneath the bleach. The sheriff knew instantly what had happened there. They had come too late. When samples from the floors were later tested in Louisville, the result was conclusive. Human blood, in multiple chambers, enough to suggest not one killing, but many. As Brenner stood beneath the mansion that day, the truth he'd chased for months pressed in on him from every direction. The walls, the air, the silence, all heavy with what the earth had witnessed and kept. But the women themselves were gone. No one saw them leave. No one ever would again. The nation awakens to a nightmare. News travels slowly through the mountains. But once it escaped Pike County, the story spread like wildfire across the nation. By the end of that July in 1877, newspapers from New York to San Francisco were printing the same headline in trembling type. "The Appalachian Heiresses vanish, murder mansion discovered in Kentucky hills." The public could not get enough of it. 2 young women, rich, beautiful, educated, accused of orchestrating a reign of terror in the wilderness. It was the perfect blend of horror and fascination. Every detail from Pike County became an obsession. The hidden tunnels, the blood-stained chambers, the crates buried in the woods. Readers devoured each new revelation with the same morbid appetite that once fueled tales of witches and ghosts. But behind the sensationalism was something darker, a collective disbelief that women could commit such crimes. Editorials struggled to make sense of it. The New York Herald declared, "The fair sex is incapable of such depravity. There must be men unseen behind this plot." Others suggested insanity, witchcraft, or hysteria. Few dared to accept the simpler, colder truth that Clara, Whitmore, and Evelyn Ashford had known exactly what they were doing. In Pike County, the mansion stood like a wound. After the search, the state sealed the tunnels and posted guards to prevent looting, but locals still crept close at night. Some claimed to hear voices whispering beneath the ground. Others said that when the wind blew from the north, you could smell iron and smoke drifting down the hill. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and progress, had become a shrine to something far older and crueler. Sheriff Thomas Brenner remained at the site for weeks, leading excavation teams through the surrounding forest. His men dug wherever the soil looked disturbed, wherever trees had grown in suspiciously straight lines. In one clearing, they found boxes half-rotted by rain. Inside were the personal belongings of men long missing, pocket watches engraved with initials, wallets filled with faded photographs, gold rings bent and tarnished by time. but no bodies. That absence haunted Brenner more than anything. The earth had swallowed its dead. Every discovery only deepened the mystery. If the heiresses had buried their victims, where were they now? How many lay undiscovered beneath those endless woods? The press began calling. The women, the Appalachian. Heiresses, a name that blended their beauty and their crimes into one chilling myth. Some papers romanticized them, describing them as angels turned avengers who had punished corrupt men. Others painted them as demons in human form, seductresses who lured victims to their deaths. The truth, the unglamorous, bone-deep evil of it all, lay somewhere in between. But the public no longer cared. The state of Kentucky, under pressure from Washington and from the outraged families of the missing, placed a bounty of $5,000 on each woman's capture, a fortune at the time. Wanted posters were printed and distributed nationwide. The descriptions were exact. Clara Whitmore, 21 years old, 5 feet 5 inches tall, dark hair, brown eyes, articulate, refined speech. Evelyn Ashford, 21 years old, slightly taller, light brown hair, green eyes, calm and reserved demeanor. The posters described them as extremely intelligent, highly dangerous, and skilled in deception. They were said to travel under false names, to pose as widows or heiresses, to use their charm as their weapon. Weeks turned into months, and still, no trace of them appeared. The marshals who had searched the mansion returned empty-handed. Their only souvenirs, the smell of bleach and the memory of the tunnels. But Sheriff Brenner refused to let the case die. He traveled across counties, following rumors of 2 women seen boarding trains, staying in inns or purchasing horses. Every lead ended the same way, with nothing but air. It was as if they had vanished from the face of the earth. By the winter of 1877, frustration gave way to obsession. Brenner began to see Clara's face everywhere, in the crowd at the Lexington station, in the reflection of the courthouse window, even in his dreams. He would wake in the night to the faint sound of footsteps outside his home, soft, measured, as though someone were walking in circles around the house. His wife urged him to stop. "The living must not chase ghosts," she said. But he couldn't stop. Not until he knew where they had gone. Meanwhile, the governor's office launched its own investigation into the failures that had allowed the heiresses to operate for so long. Reports revealed a web of corruption and cowardice, judges who ignored warrants, deputies who looked away, politicians who accepted donations in exchange for silence. The Whitmore women had not merely evaded justice. They had bought it. As for Pikeville, the town tried to move on, but it never truly recovered. People who had once admired Clara and Evelyn now felt betrayed, ashamed, even complicit. After all, hadn't they all taken their money, their charity, their gifts? The very church they attended was built with their donations. Their names, once spoken with reverence, now curdled on the tongue. The Whitmore estate was seized and sold at auction. The proceeds divided among victims' families. But no one wanted the mansion itself. It sat empty for years, its windows shattered by storms, ivy crawling up its walls. Children dared one another to climb the hill and touch the front door. Some said the door was warm to the touch even in winter. Others swore they saw candlelight flicker behind the broken panes. Then, one night in 1881, lightning struck the house during a thunderstorm. The fire spread quickly, consuming the old timbers, lighting up the sky above the valley like a second dawn. When it was over, all that remained was the stone foundation and a few scorched beams. The people of Pikeville took it as divine judgment. The hill was left barren, the tunnels sealed again with concrete. They said no one should build there, not ever. But as the fire's smoke drifted into the night, far across the ocean, in a quiet port city called Liverpool, 2 women disembarked from a ship traveling under the names Catherine Whitfield and Elizabeth Ashton. Their clothes were fine, their accents polished, and their passports flawless. They stepped onto European soil without a trace of fear. The world had declared them vanished, but they were very much alive. And in the old world, where no one knew their names or their crimes, they were about to begin again. The port of Liverpool, 1881. Fog rolled in from the Irish Sea, curling around the harbor like ghostly fingers. Steamships hissed, seagulls cried, and amid the noise of unloading cargo and shouting dock workers, 2 women walked down the gangplank of the SS Pennsylvania. They carried little more than leather trunks, and a single letter of introduction, false, of course, written on embossed stationery bearing the crest of an English family that didn't exist. The immigration officer barely looked up. "Names?" he asked. "Catherine Whitfield," said Clara, her voice calm and cultured. "Elizabeth Ashton," added Evelyn, smiling faintly. He stamped their documents and waved them through. Just like that, the ghosts of Pike County were reborn. In the crowded industrial heart of Britain, no one cared who they had been. Liverpool was a city of transients, merchants, sailors, dreamers, and criminals all flowing in and out with the tides. It was easy to disappear here, easier still to reinvent oneself. Within weeks, the two women had secured lodging in a respectable boarding house and begun blending into the genteel society that clustered around the city's growing merchant elite. Clara, now Catherine, understood quickly that in this new world, power wore a different face. Here, wealth wasn't measured in acres of land, but in shares, investments, and influence. She wasted no time adapting. She charmed bankers and traders, attending salons and gatherings under the guise of a recently widowed investor from Virginia. Her accent, softened by travel and carefully rehearsed, lent her an exotic air. Evelyn, now Elizabeth, took on the role of her companion and secretary, handling correspondence, studying markets, and ensuring their story held no cracks. Together they formed a partnership that was, as it had always been, equal parts intellect and instinct. Where Clara dazzled, Evelyn calculated. Where one smiled, the other watched. By 1882, Mrs. Whitfield had quietly purchased a townhouse in Mayfair, London, and opened what she called the Whitfield Fund, a private investment circle catering to wealthy widows seeking to secure their fortunes in an uncertain economy. It was, in truth, nothing more than a refined con. The women accepted money, promised high returns from American holdings, and paid out initial profits to gain trust. Each month, more women joined, their greed and admiration blinding them to the subtle inconsistencies in the ledgers. In less than a year, the Whitfield Fund had amassed nearly $60,000, a staggering sum, equivalent to millions today. Clara and Evelyn lived lavishly but discreetly, their charm opening doors even the titled could not. They dined with industrialists, attended operas, and were photographed at charity events where Clara's gloved hand rested delicately on Evelyn's arm. The newspapers called them the Angel Widows of London, and once again, no one questioned the shadows behind their smiles. But even in their newfound paradise, old habits returned. It began quietly, as it always did. A servant dismissed for stealing who vanished the next week. A bookkeeper who threatened to expose discrepancies in the accounts and was later found drowned in the Thames. London police recorded the deaths as accidents. No one suspected the elegant women who sent wreaths to the funerals and generous donations to the families. Behind closed doors, however, the mask began to crack. Evelyn, ever the realist, knew the pattern too well. The more successful they became, the more visible they were. "We should stop," she told Clara one night as they sat before the fire. "We have enough to live quietly for the rest of our lives. Let it end here." Clara's response was a long silence. Then softly she said, "We don't stop. We adapt." That was always the difference between them. Evelyn wanted escape. Clara wanted conquest. The power, the admiration, the control. She could no longer live without it. For her, survival wasn't enough. She needed to be the storm again. By 1884, the Whitfield Fund had expanded to Paris and Vienna, drawing in Europe's wealthiest socialites. Clara's influence grew with every ball, every whispered deal. She began moving in circles that reached into royal courts and financial houses. Even newspapers in America started writing about the mysterious American heiress who had conquered Europe's elite. None realized that the woman in the photographs, smiling beneath chandeliers, was the same Clara Whitmore who'd vanished from Kentucky 7 years before. But with visibility came risk. Among the London investors who had trusted the Whitfield Fund was a man named Sir Reginald Latham, a retired naval officer known for his suspicion of anyone too charming. Latham began to notice inconsistencies, documents with mismatched signatures, letters written on differing stationery, strange delays in dividends. Quietly, he hired an investigator. The man, Inspector Graham Holt, was meticulous and relentless. Over several months, he traced the fund's money to offshore accounts and shell, businesses that led nowhere. When he tried to meet Mrs. Whitfield to discuss the discrepancies, he was politely informed she was traveling in France. 3 weeks later, his body was found floating near Blackfriars Bridge. His report, incomplete but damning, disappeared from the police archives. Still, rumors began to circulate. Whispers in drawing rooms, half-jokes at dinner parties. The angel widows, they said, were not what they seemed. Investors quietly began to withdraw, and the facade started to tremble. Evelyn urged Clara again to leave, to disappear before it all collapsed. But Clara had already convinced herself she could outsmart anyone. Then, one autumn evening in 1885, a letter arrived bearing the seal of the American consulate. It was addressed to Mrs. Catherine Whitfield. Inside was a single page with 2 sentences that made Evelyn's blood run cold. U.S. investigators have reopened the Pike County case. Survivors have spoken. They know your names. For the first time in years, the fire in the hearth seemed to dim. Clara read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in the flames. She watched it burn, her expression unreadable. "We won't run this time," she said finally. Evelyn looked at her, horrified. "Then what will we do?" Clara smiled faintly. "What we've always done. Control the story before it controls us." By the winter of 1885, the glitter of London society that once embraced Catherine Whitfield and Elizabeth Ashton began to dim. Rumors had spread quietly but effectively. Whispers about missing ledgers, unpaid dividends, and a mysterious investigator found dead near the Thames. The women who had once been admired as models of refinement now found invitations, growing scarce and eyes turning, suspicious whenever they entered a ballroom. Clara, still calling herself Catherine, dismissed the gossip as jealousy. "We have been envied since Pikeville," she told Evelyn one night, her tone light, but her hands trembling slightly as she poured her wine. They can't destroy what they don't understand. But Evelyn knew better. She had seen this before, the slow tightening of fate, the small mistakes that became traps. The newspaper reports from America were growing more persistent. Some even reprinted sketches of the original wanted posters from 1877. 2. Young women vanish after murders in Kentucky, believed to have fled abroad. The resemblance between the women in those sketches and the angel widows of London was enough to make Evelyn's blood run cold. Then came the blow they couldn't contain. A London banking house, suspicious of the irregularities in the Whitfield Fund, demanded an independent audit. Within days, the fund's entire operation began to unravel. Inspectors found accounts that didn't balance, letters written to clients that contradicted each other, and traces of money sent through European intermediaries that led nowhere. The elegant illusion was collapsing. Clara's reaction was not panic, but something colder, calculation. "We expected this," she said. "We'll vanish again. We'll rebuild elsewhere." But Evelyn's eyes were tired now. "How many times can we vanish before we vanish from ourselves?" she whispered. Clara ignored her. She was already drafting letters, selling jewelry, converting bonds into cash. In less than 2 weeks, they liquidated what remained of their assets and boarded a private train to Paris, traveling under yet another set of names, Madame Devereux and Mademoiselle Laurent. Paris in 1886 was a city that thrived on reinvention. Artists, fugitives, and aristocrats shared cafes and scandals in equal measure. The city cared little for where someone came from, only for who they appeared to be now. For a while, Clara and Evelyn disappeared into its glittering anonymity. They rented an apartment near Montmartre, attended salons hosted by writers and painters, and even began investing in art galleries. To the casual observer, they were simply too wealthy. American women enjoying the cultural life of Europe's most beautiful city. But beneath the polished facade, cracks were widening. Evelyn had grown quiet, withdrawn, and consumed by memories she could no longer suppress. She spent long hours staring out the window at the crowded streets below, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the glass. "Do you ever think about them?" she asked Clara one night. "The men. Their families." Clara didn't look up from her papers. "Thinking doesn't change the past, but it changes us," Evelyn said. Clara set down her pen. "You mistake regret for weakness. We did what we had to do. We survived. But even she no longer sounded convinced. As the months passed, the net around them tightened. The international newspapers picked up the story again, now under a new title: The Disappearance of the Appalachian Heiresses, American. Investigators working with European. Police traced fragments of their financial trail through London and Vienna. Old contacts who had once been loyal began to talk. Rewards were offered again, higher than ever. Then, one morning, a letter arrived at their Paris apartment. It bore no return address, only a single sheet of paper with elegant handwriting that read, "You can hide from the law. You cannot hide from memory." Evelyn found the letter on the table. She said nothing, simply folded it and placed it in the fire. But that night she dreamed of Pike County, the snow, the sound of boots on wooden stairs, the echo of the sheriff's voice calling her name through the dark. She woke in tears, and for the first time in years, she prayed. Clara, meanwhile, was already planning their next move. "Switzerland?" she said one morning over breakfast. "Geneva. They protect money better than they protect truth. We'll take what remains and start again." But Evelyn no longer wanted to run. She began leaving the apartment more often, walking alone through Paris as if searching for something, or perhaps waiting for something to find her. She visited churches, bought books about redemption, and once even stopped outside a police station, staring at the door for a long time before turning away. Clara noticed the change. She watched Evelyn with the same analytical eye she once reserved for her business ledgers. "You're getting sentimental," she said coldly. "That's dangerous." Evelyn didn't argue. She simply replied, "I'm getting old." By the summer of 1887, their situation grew desperate. The authorities in France had received official requests from the United States for cooperation. Detectives circulated sketches, and informants began to appear in the cafes where the women once felt safe. Their bank accounts were frozen, their aliases known. They were running out of money, time, and places to hide. Then came one last betrayal. A man named Jean Valette, a painter they had befriended in Montmartre, recognized their faces from an American newspaper clipping and quietly alerted the police, not out of justice, but for the reward. On the night of August 22, 1887, Paris police raided their apartment. The rooms were silent, the beds empty, the windows open. The neighbors claimed they had seen two women leaving hours earlier, dressed in traveling clothes, carrying only one small trunk. They vanished again. The police searched the city, the train stations, the ports, but found nothing. It was as if they had stepped through a door no one else could see. Some claimed the women fled to Switzerland, others that they drowned themselves in the Seine River. A few whispered that they lived under false names in Italy, or even crossed the ocean again under new disguises. But the truth, the real truth, would only emerge decades later, long after everyone in Pikeville had grown old, long after their names had faded into folklore. For now, the world believed the Appalachian heiresses were gone forever. Yet somewhere across the quiet borders of Europe, two women were still out there, shadows walking in daylight, waiting for history to forget. The years rolled forward, and the world changed. The century turned, and the story of the two missing women from Kentucky, once the most talked about scandal in America, faded into something quieter, stranger, a whisper, a superstition, a cautionary tale told in mountain towns and parlor rooms. In Pike County, the Whitmore mansion no longer existed. After the fire of 1881, nothing had been rebuilt. The state had leveled the remains, sealed the tunnels with concrete, and sold the surrounding land to small farmers. By the early 1900s, the hill was covered in grass again. Cows grazed where once stood an empire of fear. Children played on the slopes without knowing that the ground beneath their feet was heavy with secrets. But stories linger longer than structures. Locals still spoke of the Appalachian heiresses in low tones, especially on cold nights when the wind howled through the trees. They said you could sometimes hear laughter, women's laughter, drifting from the hilltop, light and mocking, as if echoing from another time. For the rest of America, Clara Whitmore and Evelyn Ashford had become symbols rather than people. Penny novels turned their crimes into Gothic fiction, transforming them into beautiful monsters, tragic heroines, or supernatural avengers. depending on the writer's taste. Historians, when they mentioned them at all, did so skeptically, claiming that the evidence was inconclusive, that the entire affair was exaggerated by newspapers hungry for sensation. Then, in 1912, the past reached out again. It began with the death of an elderly American woman in Nice, France. Her name, according to French records, was Catherine Whitfield, a widow who had lived quietly for more than 3 decades on the Riviera. Her estate was sizable, investments in European railroads, mining stocks, and Swiss accounts totaling what would now be millions. Her neighbors described her as cultured, kind, and reserved. An American lady of good breeding, they said. But when her will was opened, it contained something extraordinary and a sealed letter, written in English, addressed to the U.S. consulate in Paris with strict instructions, to be delivered upon my death, personal to the authorities of the United States. The consulate received it within days. Inside were 23 handwritten pages, written in a steady, elegant hand. The title on the first page was chilling in its simplicity. Confession of Clara Elizabeth Whitmore. The consul, stunned, contacted Washington immediately. Soon, the document reached American newspapers. And by the end of the summer, the world knew what had been hidden for 35 years. Clara was alive, or rather, she had been. Her confession began without apology. I, Clara Elizabeth Whitmore, born in Pike County, Kentucky, do write these words of my own will, fully aware of their meaning and without the slightest expectation of forgiveness. From there, the pages unfolded with the cold precision of someone recounting business. Not murder. She admitted to everything, the disappearances, the tunnels, the buried belongings, the calculated lures. She described each man not by name, but by profession, the merchant, the lawyer, the surveyor, the journalist. But the most unsettling part wasn't the crimes themselves. It was the logic behind them. Clara wrote that it all began with anger. A merchant who had cheated her after her father's death, mocking her intelligence because she was a woman. She claimed he threatened to ruin her inheritance. And in that moment, something in me broke, the part that cared what men thought of me. His death, she wrote, was not planned, but it was liberating. When Evelyn discovered what had happened, she didn't recoil. According to Clara, she understood. Evelyn, too, had lived through a fire she now admitted was no accident. Drunken men had set it, burning her family alive during a land dispute, and no one had been punished. We had both been denied justice, Clara wrote, so we learned to make our own. Their killings, at least in Clara's mind, were not random. She portrayed them as punishments for cruelty, hypocrisy, and exploitation. But the tone of her writing betrayed no remorse, no sorrow, only order, as though she were explaining the function of a machine. We did not act from madness. We acted from design. We chose men who believed their power protected them, and we proved them wrong. The confession went on to describe their escape from Pikeville, their voyage to Europe, the creation of the Whitfield Fund in London, and even the subsequent deaths linked to their names. She admitted to orchestrating the death of Inspector Holt, calling it an act of necessity, but perhaps the most shocking revelation came near the end. Evelyn, Clara revealed, had died in 1907 from pneumonia in their home in Nice. Her grave, marked simply Elizabeth Ashton, lay in a small cemetery overlooking the sea. She went peacefully, Clara wrote. She believed our story would end with silence. But I have chosen confession instead, for silence is a prison, and I have lived long enough inside it. In her final paragraphs, Clara described leaving detailed instructions for her wealth. She ordered that it be used to compensate, as far as possible, the descendants of her victims. She even listed the locations of burial sites never discovered during the 1877 investigation. The letter ended with a single line that chilled every reader who saw it. Evil, when born of reason, does not see itself as evil, but history will. When her confession was published, it reignited fascination worldwide. Newspapers ran her portrait side by side with the faded wanted sketches from Pike County. Editorials debated whether she was a feminist avenger or a calculating sociopath. The truth was simpler and darker. She was both victim and predator. Intellect and cruelty intertwined so completely that it was impossible to separate one from the other. For the families of the missing men, the confession brought closure and pain. Expeditions were launched to the sites Clara described. In several cases, remains were found exactly where she said they would be, confirming the truth of her story. The bones were carefully gathered, identified by personal items, and given proper burials decades too late. Yet not everyone accepted her final gesture of contrition. Many descendants refused the money she left behind. "We don't take blood gold," one said. Others accepted, arguing that justice, even if delayed, had finally come full circle. And as for Clara herself, the woman who had written her name into the darkest corner of American history, she was buried in Nice, under the same false name she had worn for most of her life. Her grave was simple, unmarked beyond the pseudonym Catherine Whitfield. No mention of her crimes, no hint of who she truly was, but perhaps that was fitting. After all, Clara had lived her life hiding behind names. Now, in death, she hid behind one more. The news of Clara Whitmore's confession spread through America like a ghost re-entering the room it once haunted. Every major newspaper reprinted it in full, some serializing it across a week of front pages. Readers devoured her words as though they were chapters of a Gothic novel, yet the horror lay in their authenticity. She had written not from hysteria or revenge, but from clarity. That was what disturbed people most. The United States, now in the modern age of the early 20th century, prided itself on progress. Telephones, automobiles, new cities rising across the plains but Clara's confession dragged the country backward into its own unhealed past. She was a relic of a time when isolation and corruption had allowed entire communities to live beyond the reach of law. For weeks, the nation debated what her story meant. The New York Times called it a moral earthquake, declaring that her words remind us that civilization's surface is thin, and beneath it sleeps something feral. Harper's Weekly ran an essay titled The Curse of the Appalachian Heiresses, arguing that her crimes were born not from gender, but from a culture that confused respectability with righteousness. Public fascination bordered on obsession. Photographs of Clara's French home appeared in magazines. Journalists traveled to Nice, interviewing her neighbors and servants. They described her as a gracious, intelligent woman who read philosophy, kept gardens, and seemed incapable of cruelty. One remarked, if not for her own words, no one would have believed her capable of such deeds. In Kentucky, the reaction was far more complex. Pike County, once forgotten, was thrust back into the national spotlight. Reporters flooded the region, searching for remnants of the Whitmore estate. They climbed the hill where the mansion had stood, now overgrown with wild grass and young pines. Locals pointed out where the tunnels had been sealed, where they claimed to have seen strange lights after dark. Some insisted the ground still whispered when the wind blew from the east. The descendants of those who had lived under Clara and Evelyn's shadow were divided. Some wanted the story buried again. "Let the dead rest," they said. Others demanded that history finally acknowledge what had happened. The county courthouse, reluctant but pressured, reopened its archives. Old files were unearthed, Brenner's handwritten reports, Sarah Cunningham's notebooks, fragments of the Mountain Echo newspaper salvaged from its fire-blackened ruins. Together they formed a mosaic of a community that had once chosen silence over truth. Historians began to study the case in universities. Criminal psychologists cited it as one of the earliest documented examples of organized female violence, a phenomenon long dismissed by Victorian scholars as impossible. Legal reformers pointed to the failures of jurisdiction that allowed Clara and Evelyn's crimes to go unchecked for years. Their story became a catalyst for discussions that shaped modern criminal procedure, cross-county cooperation, federal oversight, and the introduction of early forensic methods. Sheriff Thomas Brenner, once nearly forgotten, was posthumously honored. His detailed journals, meticulous, restrained, and brave, became essential reading for young lawmen across the country. His last line in the final entry, written just before the mansion raid, was engraved later on a plaque at the Pikeville courthouse. "Evil hides where we stop looking." But progress did not erase shame. Pikeville's older residents felt the story as a curse. They avoided speaking the women's names aloud. Some swore that misfortunes, failed harvests, sickness, Storms were punishments for the sins the town had once ignored. The church bells that had once rung for Clara's donations now rang for repentance. Yet among the younger generation, curiosity replaced fear. They grew up with the story whispered in classrooms and kitchens. For them, the Appalachian heiresses were no longer just monsters. They were warnings of what happens when wealth breeds impunity, when power silences conscience, and when society refuses to question its idols. By the 1930s, true crime writers rediscovered the case. Books titled The Heiresses of Blood and Murder in the Mountains transformed Clara and Evelyn into tragic anti-heroes. Films followed, romanticizing them as doomed lovers or misunderstood visionaries. Hollywood softened their edges, turning horror into spectacle. But in Pike County, the descendants of their victims never forgot the real cost. Then came the rediscovery of Sarah, Cunningham's notebooks, the librarian, who had quietly recorded every suspicious disappearance in the 1870s. They were found in 1946 in a chest donated to the County Historical Society by her distant relatives. The notes matched Clara's confession line for line, proving that Sarah had known the truth decades before the world did. She had written one sentence on the final page that historians still quote today: "Silence is not innocence." By the mid-20th century, the Whitmore story had become a subject of both fascination and discomfort. Universities taught it as a case study in criminology and social psychology. Feminist scholars re-examined it, arguing that Clara's rage, though monstrous, was born from the suffocating injustice of her time. Others rejected that idea, calling it an insult to the real victims. In Pikeville itself, the argument reached its peak in the 1980s, when the community debated whether to mark the site of the old Whitmore mansion. After months of contention, they agreed on a simple compromise, a modest plaque at the base of the hill. It bore no mention of the killers' names. Instead, it read, "Here stood the home of tragedy. May truth always outlive silence." Even so, locals say that when fog settles over the ridge at dusk, you can still sense something there, not ghosts, but memory itself refusing to die. The land healed, but history never fully did. The Whitmore case became more than just a tale of murder. It was a mirror held up to a nation that preferred myths of purity over uncomfortable truths. Clara's confession, stored in a temperature-controlled vault in the Pike County Historical Archives, remains one of the most requested documents by researchers to this day. Visitors often remark that her handwriting is precise, almost beautiful, looping, elegant, and deliberate, the script of a woman who never lost control. Even when she was confessing to atrocity, a century later, scholars still argue about her final motive. Was it remorse or one last act of manipulation? Was her confession a reckoning, or simply her attempt to shape the story before history did it for her? No one can say for certain. But one thing remains clear: the Appalachian heiresses were not erased by time. They became time, a permanent scar on the history of justice, a haunting reminder that civilization's surface is only as strong as the conscience beneath it. By the early 21st century, 130 years after the fires of Pikeville and the vanishing of two 19-year-old women, the story of Clara Whitmore and Evelyn Ashford had become more than a true crime. It had become a meditation on power, guilt, and memory. Time had sanded away the sensational headlines and the public outrage, leaving behind a quieter, heavier question: what does it mean for a story to survive when its people do not? Scholars still debated the meaning of Clara's confession. Historians called her a manipulator to the end, a woman who confessed only to regain control of the narrative she had once lost. Psychologists called her a study in moral dissociation, a human mind that could rationalize horror as justice. Feminist historians read her words differently, as a woman shaped by the cruelty of her world, whose vengeance had curdled into something monstrous but born of systemic rot. In the middle of all that noise, Pike County tried to move forward. The hill where the mansion once stood was now part of a wildlife reserve. The only markers of the past were the stone, foundation outlines still visible through the grass, and the plaque that read simply, "May truth always outlive silence." Tourists came rarely, but those who did spoke of a feeling they couldn't explain. The air there was still, unnaturally so. Birds avoided the ridge. Locals said compasses spun when you stood at the old foundation. No one could say if it was magnetic. interference, or just the weight of too many stories buried beneath the soil. In 2009, a historian named Dr. Amelia Kerr, researching the legacy of women in frontier America, traveled to France to visit the cemetery in Nice where Clara had been. Buried under her false name, Catherine Whitfield. The small cemetery overlooked the sea, its rows of marble and limestone warmed by Mediterranean sun. She found the grave easily, a modest white stone among dozens of others. The inscription was almost erased by weather. Catherine Whitfield, 1856-1912. No epitaph, no family name, no sign of what she had been. Next to it stood a smaller headstone, more weathered still. Elizabeth Ashton, 1856-1907. Dr. Kerr stood between them, listening to the hum of cicadas and the distant crash of waves. It struck her that the two women, who had once ruled a valley in blood and fear, were now nothing more than forgotten, names on crumbling stone. The world had moved on. And yet in that quiet moment, she felt the weight of something unresolved. Not forgiveness, not condemnation, but an awareness that history never truly buries what it cannot understand. She wrote later in her journal, they were both victims of their own century and architects of their own damnation. Time punished them more completely than any gallows could. Dr. Kerr arranged for soil samples to be taken from the graves, purely for historical documentation. When DNA analysis was later compared to remains found years earlier at one of the Pikeville excavation sites, the match was conclusive. It confirmed what the world had already suspected, that Catherine Whitfield had indeed been Clara Whitmore and Elizabeth Ashton was Evelyn Ashford. The revelation reignited media fascination for a few months. Documentaries followed, modern retellings mixing fact and dramatization. But for those who had studied the case their entire lives, the DNA confirmation wasn't the shocking part. What mattered more was the closure it provided. The ghosts had finally been named, their bones reunited with their truth. Still, questions remained. Why had Clara confessed only after Evelyn's death? Why choose to die quietly rather than face the world's judgment? And why, after all those years of hiding, did she feel the need to make her story known? Perhaps, as some suggested, she feared oblivion more than condemnation. To Clara Whitmore, erasure might have been the only fate worse than infamy. In Pikeville, the renewed attention brought another wave of visitors. Journalists, students, and filmmakers arrived to capture the place where it all began. They filmed the mist rolling across the hills, the way the light broke through the pines, the old foundation stones darkened by rain. The documentaries always ended the same way, with the camera pulling back from the empty hill, the narrator's voice low and thoughtful. All that remains now is silence, but even silence remembers. In time, the fascination faded again. The world found new monsters, new stories. Yet the legend of the Appalachian Heiresses persisted, not because of their crimes alone, but because their story exposed something timeless about human nature, our capacity for reinvention, for cruelty dressed as reason, for beauty hiding rot. Every decade or so, someone still claims to see them. A pair of women walking through the fog near the hilltop, their faces pale, their dresses from another age. Locals shrug it off, but deep down, no one truly laughs. The mountains hold their own kind of memory. And the Appalachians, it seems, never forget. And so the story ends where it began, in the quiet hum of the hills, where truth and legend intertwine until they are inseparable. Two 19-year-old women, once heirs to fortune and promise, became architects of dread. They defied a world that sought to control them, only to become prisoners of their own control. They vanished, reappeared, confessed, and died under borrowed names, leaving behind not redemption but reflection. For more than a century, their tale has whispered the same lesson through generations. That the past never dies and it only changes its disguise. And on cold nights, when the fog settles deep over the valley and the moonlight paints the ridge in silver, those who listen closely say they can still hear the faint echo of two women laughing, distant, defiant, and eternal. By the time the 21st century reached its third decade, the names Clara Whitmore and Evelyn Ashford had drifted into that uncertain space between myth and memory, where history fades just enough to invite imagination. Their story was taught in universities, fictionalized in streaming dramas, dissected in podcasts, and quoted by journalists whenever power and morality collided. Yet even as technology moved the world forward, the essence of their story felt stubbornly present, like an echo that refuses to fade beneath the noise of progress. In 2021, the Smithsonian Museum of American History unveiled a temporary exhibit titled Women of the Shadows: Crime and Power in 19th Century America. At its center, beneath glass and careful light, rested two artifacts: the final page of Clara Whitmore's confession and one of Evelyn Ashford's letters from 1875, recovered decades earlier from a private collection. The juxtaposition was striking. Evelyn's letter, written before their crimes had consumed them, spoke of longing, of wanting to make a mark on a world that refuses to see women as more than ornaments. Clara's confession, written 30 years later, was stripped of sentiment. We made our mark. We carved it into the earth, and the earth remembers. Visitors lingered longest at those two pieces. Some saw tragedy, others saw madness. Many saw warning. The exhibit drew record attendance, and debates reignited in academic circles. Were Clara and Evelyn aberrations, or were they the logical product of a society that gave women no lawful way to wield power? Dr. Amelia Kerr, now one of the foremost scholars on the case, lectured at the exhibit's opening. Standing before the faded confession, she told the audience, "We can condemn them without misunderstanding them. What they did was monstrous, but monsters are rarely born. They are made." Her words echoed across social media, sparking renewed debate. Some critics accused her of romanticizing killers. Others praised her for confronting the uncomfortable truth: that evil often grows from the soil of injustice. Back in Pike County, life went on quietly. The hill remained untouched, its plaque weathered but intact. Locals were accustomed to outsiders arriving with cameras and curiosity, asking for directions to the Whitmore site. Most visitors came with reverence. A few came chasing ghosts. The townspeople no longer hid the story, but they didn't glorify it either. They called it the scar, and every generation inherited its ache. One spring, a film crew from New York arrived to shoot a documentary titled The Hill That Watched. They brought drones, microphones, and questions, endless questions about guilt, fear, and legacy. They interviewed elderly residents whose grandparents had known, the families of the victims. One old man, 87 years old, stood before the camera and said simply, "My great-grandfather helped seal those tunnels. He said he could feel the ground breathing. He told my father, 'You can bury a body. You can't bury a story.' He was right." That line became the film's closing quote, and truer words were never spoken. Even a century and a half later, Clara and Evelyn's story felt alive because it was never just about them. It was about how society creates its monsters, then spends generations trying to decide whether to fear them or understand them. In their lifetime, the women had exploited every weakness of the world that underestimated them: its sexism, its greed, its complacency. And in doing so, they revealed something that time hadn't erased: that evil isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's polite, educated, and articulate. Sometimes it holds your gaze and smiles. In 2025, a small group of archaeologists and historians from the University of Kentucky began a new excavation near the old Whitmore site, not to search for more bodies, but to study the architecture of the tunnels described in Clara's confession. Using ground-penetrating radar, they found what earlier investigators had missed: a second network of chambers deeper than the original search had ever reached. Inside one sealed passage, they uncovered rusted tools, scorched lanterns, and a single metal box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside the box were ledgers written in Evelyn's neat hand. They weren't records of business or victims, but journals, observations, reflections, the kind of thoughts that might have become a confession, had she lived long enough to write one. One passage stood out: "We built walls to keep secrets, and they became our tombs long before we died. I used to think we were escaping the past, but the past followed us like a shadow." Perhaps that is all we ever were: two shadows pretending to be women. The journals added a layer of humanity the world had never seen in Evelyn before. Historians began to see her not as a mirror of Clara, but as her conscience, the quieter voice drowned out by the will of a woman who refused to repent. When the journals were displayed alongside Clara's confession, visitors said it felt as though the two women were finally speaking to one another across time, the predator and the penitent, the voice of reason and the echo of ruin. In a world addicted to retellings, their story refused to die because it wasn't finished. It was a mirror, one that reflected not just them, but every generation's idea of power, guilt, and gender. Some called it America's original female true crime tragedy. Others called it the first psychological portrait of women pushed to the edge of moral wilderness. But perhaps the most haunting truth was that Clara and Evelyn had achieved what they always wanted to be remembered. Their names, once erased from record, were now immortalized in textbooks, documentaries, and museum glass. History, in trying to condemn them, had also given them the permanence they craved. And maybe, in some way, that was their final victory, or their final curse. The Appalachian Mountains have always had a strange relationship with time. They are among the oldest in the world, older than the Rockies, older than the Alps, carved by patience rather than violence. To live in their shadow is to understand that time does not move here the way it does elsewhere. It circles, it hums, it waits. And within that patience, stories linger like the scent of pine after rain. The story of Clara Whitmore and Evelyn Ashford became one of those lingering truths, an echo, folded into the mountain's long memory. Long after the world moved on, the people of Pike County still felt their presence, not as ghosts but as symbols, reminders, of what the human heart can become when isolation meets ambition, when intellect outruns empathy. Every few years, the fog thickens around the old Whitmore Hill, and locals say you can hear things in it, not voices exactly, but the sound of something living beneath the quiet. The wind moves strangely there, as though caught between centuries. It carries faint rhythms, like footsteps or laughter, or maybe just the creak of the forest remembering. Scientists call it pareidolia, the mind finding meaning in random sounds. The older folk have another explanation. The mountain remembers what the world forgets. In the early 2030s, Pike County commissioned a memorial installation, not a monument to the killers, but a reckoning with the past. Designed by a Kentucky-born artist, it was built on the exact spot where the Whitmore mansion once stood. From a distance, it looks like a circle of broken stone columns open to the sky. Inside the circle, a single mirrored surface reflects whoever stands before it. Etched beneath the glass are the words, "This is not a place of judgment. This is a place of memory." Visitors who come there describe an unsettling stillness. No birds, no insects, only the low hum of wind against stone. The installation's design is deliberate, meant to remind the living that every story, even one drenched in blood, is still part of the fabric of human history. Students from nearby universities visit often. They stand in silence, reading the names of victims carved along the base, the merchants, the lawyers, the travelers whose lives ended in the tunnels below. Some leave flowers, others notes. But sometimes, tucked between the offerings, there are small handwritten letters addressed to Clara and Evelyn. Some beg forgiveness for judging. Others demand apology. A few simply say, "I understand." It seems that even after a century and a half, people still find reflections of themselves in the story. Ambition, anger, grief, survival. Perhaps that's why it endures. The Appalachian Heiresses were never just killers. They were a mirror for everything civilization doesn't want to admit, that refinement can coexist with brutality, that education doesn't erase cruelty, and that the human soul, when deprived of empathy, becomes as wild as the mountains that once hid them. One autumn, Dr. Amelia Kerr returned to Pikeville for a symposium marking the 150th anniversary of the Whitmore discovery. Standing before a small crowd of journalists and students, she read from Evelyn's rediscovered journals, her voice soft but steady. "We built walls to keep secrets, and they became our tombs long before we died." Then she looked out over the mist-cloaked ridge. "Those words," she said, "aren't just about them. They're about us. Every time we hide truth behind wealth, power, or silence, we build another wall, and the mountain watches, waiting for it to fall." Her speech went viral. For a brief moment, Clara and Evelyn's story found new life online, carried not as a scandal, but as a metaphor. People quoted it in think pieces, documentaries, even songs. The Whitmore mansion became less a crime scene and more a moral landscape, a place where human frailty met history's silence. Yet beneath all the noise, the land itself remained quiet. Seasons passed, snow melting into wildflowers, rivers cutting deeper into the stone. The past no longer screamed here. It whispered. Nature had reclaimed what human hands had defiled. But sometimes, late in winter, when the moonlight hit the ridge just right, hikers reported seeing something strange. Two silhouettes, pale and indistinct, walking along the tree line, always together, always silent. One said it was tricks of light. Another swore he heard laughter, faint and fleeting, as though carried on the wind from another century. Even skeptics admitted that the place had an energy they couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was history. Maybe it was guilt. Or maybe, as the locals like to say, the mountains keep what they're given, and they had been given a lot. For Pikeville, the legacy of the Whitmore women became a lesson passed down not through textbooks, but through stories told at kitchen tables and schoolyards. Parents taught their children that truth matters, that silence is its accomplice, that kindness means more than control. It was a small redemption, quiet, fragile, but real. In time, the story's moral evolved. It was no longer just about two women who killed and vanished. It was about the society that allowed them to thrive, the systems that protected them, the people who looked away. Clara Whitmore had written in her confession that evil, when born of reason, does not see itself as evil. Perhaps she was right. But she had forgotten one thing. Reason fades, but history doesn't. The mountains remember. The wind remembers. And somewhere, deep beneath the soil, the tunnels still hold their silence. An ancient kind of silence that does not forgive, but does not forget either. Maybe that's what justice truly is, not vengeance. Not punishment, but remembrance. The refusal to let the past vanish quietly. And as the sun sets over Pikeville, painting the ridge in gold and shadow, the mist drifts once more across the old Whitmore hill. The glass memorial glows faintly, catching the last light of day, and for a fleeting moment, the reflection shows not faces but movement. Two faint shapes, side by side, walking toward the trees. Then the light fades, and the mountains close around them once more. At dusk, the Appalachian mountains glow like burning embers, ridges washed in amber light, the valleys below melting into shadow. The wind moves through the pines with the low hum of an ancient hymn, the same sound that has followed generations here long before. Clara Whitmore and Evelyn Ashford ever lived, and as that wind rises, you can almost imagine it carrying voices, faint, feminine, unrepentant, not haunting exactly but lingering. The story of the Appalachian Heiresses doesn't end in the tunnels, or the confession written decades later in a quiet French villa. It ends here, where nature took back what humanity defiled, and silence became the only witness left. The mountain does not judge, but it does not forget. Time has turned Clara and Evelyn into what history often makes, of its most complex figures, symbols, stripped of nuance and repainted to fit the morals of each new age. In the early 1900s, they were devils in petticoats, an affront to womanhood and faith. By the 1970s, they were misunderstood feminists, rebelling against patriarchal violence. In the 21st century, they became something else entirely, a psychological study in how brilliance and brutality can share the same mind. But the truth, as it always was, remains more unsettling than any theory. They were both brilliant and monstrous, victims and architects, flesh and myth, bound together in a pact that outlived them both. When historians study their lives now, they speak less about their crimes and more about what those crimes revealed. How society looked away from evil when it was dressed in civility. How wealth softened judgment. How silence became a kind of complicity. And how, in the end, the women who had once defied every convention of their time were remembered not for their freedom, but for the prison they built themselves. A prison made of lies, secrets, and silence. At the University of Kentucky, a course titled The Heiresses of Appalachia, Power and Morality in Frontier America, fills every semester. Students read Clara's confession, Evelyn's journals, and even the editorials written by the journalists who chased the truth through mountains and rumor. In discussions, someone always asks the same question: do you think they ever regretted it? The professor usually pauses before answering. Perhaps not in the way you think. they say. Clara regretted being caught by time. Evelyn regretted being caught by conscience. But neither ever regretted each other. That, in the end, might be the truest thing ever said about them. Whatever else they were, killers, visionaries, liars, lovers, survivors, they were bound by a devotion that outlasted morality. Together, they created a world that answered only to them. Together, they burned it down, and yet a strange grace lingers over their memory. Not forgiveness, never that, but understanding. The kind of understanding that history gives when rage fades and only reflection remains. The mountain is indifferent, but people are not. We study monsters to understand ourselves. We tell their stories to remind us of the line between justice and vengeance, between courage and cruelty. Clara and Evelyn blurred those lines until they vanished completely. In a way, their story is the story of humanity itself. Brilliance corrupted by bitterness, strength twisted into control, the longing for power mutating into destruction. It's the story of what happens when people stop seeing others as human and start seeing them as obstacles or debts to be collected. But for all the horror, there's something undeniably tragic about the way it ends. Clara, dying alone by the French Riviera, writing her confession under a false name, not to repent but to be remembered. Evelyn, gone years before, her lungs collapsing under pneumonia, leaving behind a silence Clara never managed to fill. The two of them buried side by side, under names the world never knew, their bones resting in peace the law never gave them. A historian once wrote, "If they were born a century later, Clara Whitmore might have run a corporation. Evelyn Ashford might have led a bank. Their ruthlessness would have been rewarded, their ambition applauded." It's a chilling thought. That time, not morality, defines how we judge our monsters. And so the story lives on, not as a warning alone, but as a mirror. Every generation finds something of itself in Clara and Evelyn. For some, they're a reminder of what happens when power corrupts. For others, a testament to how injustice breeds its own devils. For most, they are simply proof that history is never clean, that beneath the stories of progress and faith and civilization, there are always shadows whispering from the past. The last line of Clara's confession reads, "The mountains will outlive us all. Let them keep what they've seen." She was right. The Appalachians still stand, weathered, ancient, indifferent. The pines still whisper. The rivers still carve their patient paths. And somewhere under that soil, beneath roots and rock and the slow crawl of centuries, the tunnels remain sealed, filled not with bodies anymore, but with stories. If you stand there long enough, just as twilight fades into the cold clarity of night, you might hear the mountain breathe. The air feels older there, heavier, aware. The silence isn't empty. It's waiting, and in that stillness, if you listen closely, you might hear a faint echo, two young women laughing softly, as if daring the world to forget them. But the world never will, because the Appalachian Heiresses are no longer just a story about what they did. They are a story about what we are capable of in it when power blinds compassion, when intellect outruns conscience, when humanity forgets its own reflection. And that is why, even now, the legend of Clara Whitmore and Evelyn Ashford remains too dark for history books to tell easily, but too real to ever be erased. As the night deepens over Pikeville and the mist curls once more along the hills, the mountain stands silent, watching, timeless, eternal, and somewhere beyond the veil of time and sound, two shadows walk side by side through the fog, bound forever by the empire they built, and the silence that outlived them both.